A small group of volunteers are here on Taiwan's east coast cleaning up a massive oil spill, but they're outnumbered.
Chinese military activity ramps up ahead of Taiwan's elections.
I'm Rik Glauert for TaiwanPlus, here in the mountains of southern Taiwan, with a report for you on how Taiwan's indigenous minority are finding their voice in national politics.
Plus, COP28 ends with a deal to move away from fossil fuels. Good evening and welcome to TaiwanPlus News. I'm Rik Glauert. Volunteers are struggling to clean up a massive oil spill in northeastern Taiwan. Laurel Stewart went to Yilan County to find out more.
We're here in Yilan on Taiwan's east coast on what is a very ordinary beach. But if you look closely, the rocks here are all covered in thick, sticky oil. Now, it's something that the locals here discovered this morning, but it's actually an issue that's been afflicting the whole of the east coast for the past week. The oil spill originally came from the south near Taitung and Green Island, and it's been moving in the water northwards over the past week. Now, volunteers have come here to clean up the oil on the rocks, but if you look at how big this beach is, and this is just one of many along the east coast of Taiwan, they're moving in tiny increments along the rocks. Volunteers here are using these sheets to wipe off the oil from the rocks, and it's a very arduous process because it has to be done by hand and the oil is really thick. It comes off like this, but it still leaves remnants of the oil on the rocks. Now, they say there's not enough people doing this job. There's not enough time to prevent the oil coming in. It's still in the water and it's still moving northward, which means the oil is getting into the ecosystem, it's getting all over the rocks, it's in the fish, and they say there's not enough being done to understand the source of these problems coming in. Luffy Lee and Laurel Stewart in Yilan, Taiwan for TaiwanPlus.
China is ramping up military activity around Taiwan just a month before Taiwan's national elections. Jaime Okan has this update.
A report from Reuters is revealing that Taiwan's military had to fend off at least 4 attempts from China as it approached Taiwan's contiguous zone. Now that's 24 nautical miles from its coast. Unnamed officials told Reuters that it's part of a larger campaign by Beijing to try and sway voters ahead of the elections in January. Officials here in Taiwan say that those 4 attempts included a combination of weather balloons, fighter jets, and other commercial ships coming close to the country last month in an effort to intimidate voters. TaiwanPlus reached out to the Defense Ministry for a comment, but did not receive a response by the time of air. China claims Taiwan is part of its own and regularly operates military aircraft and warships around the country. But officials here are concerned that that activity is going to increase ahead of the elections on January 13th. Beijing says that when Taiwanese voters go to the polls, they're not just picking a candidate, they're picking between war and peace. But Taiwan says that China should respect its election process and will not be deterred. Eason Ten and Jaime Okan in Taipei for TaiwanPlus.
Now, when Taiwan's indigenous people cast their votes in January, their ballots will look a little different from others. Rik Glauert explains.
Legislative candidate Savangan travelled nearly 400 kilometres from her home in Taiwan's capital, Taipei, to canvass for votes in this village in the country's rural south. She's running for one of 6 special seats in the legislature reserved for the country's indigenous people.
当然啦，尤其是我这次是年轻的无党参选人，所以你要跑全国的那个选区的范围啊，跟那个就我们的选区跟总统的选区一样大。
Like the rest of Taiwan's 600,000 indigenous population, Savangan cannot run as or vote for a representative of the constituency she lives in. Only in this parallel election for 6 of the legislature's 113 seats.
Reserved indigenous seats were introduced into Taiwan's legislature decades ago as a largely symbolic acknowledgement of the country's often marginalised minority. Now, many within the community say it hasn't given them a greater voice in national politics.
Unlike the majority of legislators who represent a geographic district, Indigenous legislators act on behalf of voters spanning the length of the country. But Indigenous communities say the system sidelines local issues, problems like unemployment and access to healthcare, which disproportionately affect the Indigenous population.
所以形成感觉好像，有的时候会感觉不是很完美、很完整。
我是觉得我会觉得分区会比较好啊，因为如果我住在南部，我当然希望更多的资源都跟我有关系。
It's also an issue of identity. Indigenous voters are divided into highland and lowland people. It's a categorization introduced by the Japanese when they ruled Taiwan for 50 years up to 1945. But this does not reflect the country's 16 officially recognized indigenous groups that each have their own language and culture.
因为人是会移动的，从前住在山地乡的原住民呢，也会到都会地区来工作生活。那住在都会地区的原住民呢，也有可能回到自己的部落跟家乡。然后再加上婚姻啊、嫁娶啊，搬来搬去，所以这一套所谓的山地原住民跟平地原住民的这个制度呢，已经跟当时设计的时候的概念跟理想状况呢是不一样的。
A young and enthusiastic democracy, Taiwan has one of the highest voter turnouts in the world. But Indigenous candidates like Savangan feel they are contending with an outdated and imperfect system as they struggle to increase their voice in national politics. John Su and Rik Glauert for TaiwanPlus.
To find out more about how the reserved Indigenous lawmaker seats work, Rik Glauert spoke to Scott Simon, a professor of sociology and anthropology at the University of Ottawa.
So Taiwan has reserved seats in the legislature for Indigenous people. Could you tell us how this system works and how did it come about?
Beginning in the 1950s or 60s, that when the ROC came to Taiwan, the idea was to modernize the way in which Indigenous peoples participate in the political system. Because, of course, during the Japanese period, it was not the kind of democracy that it is today. And they, in order to guarantee the right of Indigenous people to participate in politics, they created a quota for Indigenous members of the Provincial Assembly. And so basically what's happened is that beginning in the 1992, the first direct legislative elections, they kind of transferred that notion over to the Legislative Yuan. And so there's a quota of Indigenous legislators. What's special about it as well is that they divide it into two different kinds of Indigenous peoples. And that is often quite confusing for people, but they call them the mountain groups and the plains groups.
And based on your observations and experience, is it working in the way it was intended to work?
I think that it does guarantee representation. When I compare it, for example, it's worth looking at New Zealand as well because they have a Indigenous role. Theirs is different. It functions in a very different way. But when I look at Canada, for example, because there is no quota for Indigenous legislators in Canada's parliament, the number fluctuates, and sometimes it's less than their percentage in the population, and sometimes there's a much larger representation of Indigenous peoples in parliament than one would have here. And so I think that it does play in both ways, that it does, at least it guarantees a minimum, but at the same time, you're right, it does create a very different electoral process for the Indigenous people because they've got a different slate of candidates for the legislature.
And how would you say the system of reserved seats affects the way Taiwan's Indigenous people engage with the democratic progress?
So what I find is that the elections are a very big part of Indigenous life. The candidates often come to visit, and that's where it makes it a very different dynamic because the Indigenous candidates, unlike every other candidate for the legislature, are not doing their campaigning in a local area. They actually have to go all over Taiwan. And so they complain about that, actually. They say that they have to dedicate the time and financial resources just like a presidential candidate would, to travel all over Taiwan and then to nourish contacts with people all over Taiwan.
That was University of Ottawa professor Scott Simon speaking with our reporter Rik Glauert. The United Nations is demanding an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. The body voted on the resolution as the death toll from Israel's offensive against Hamas continues to climb. 153 countries voted in favor, 23 abstained, and only 10 voted against it, including Israel and the United States. They say a ceasefire would only help Hamas militants. Gaza's health ministry says the violence has killed more than 18,000 people and displaced 85% of the enclave's population. The war started after Hamas raided Israel in early October, killing 1,200 people. Ukraine's president is trying to get more U.S. funding for his country's war against Russia. Volodymyr Zelensky met with congressional Republicans who are opposed to giving Ukraine any more aid. They say that money should be used on security at the U.S.'s southern border instead. Zelensky's visit comes as Ukraine faces a Russian resurgence in the war after a counteroffensive by Kyiv failed to make as much progress as hoped. U.S. President Joe Biden met with Zelensky and pleaded with Republicans not to deny Ukraine's request for help.
We're rapidly coming to an end of our ability to help Ukraine respond to the urgent operational demands that it has. Putin is banking on the United States failing to deliver for Ukraine. We must prove him wrong.
The COP28 Climate Summit has reached an agreement for the world to move away from dependence on fossil fuels. Harold Hughes has this report.
It is so decided.
Passed with applause. An agreement to transition away from fossil fuels at this year's COP28 Climate Summit in Dubai is finally passed after 2 weeks of meetings.
Enhanced, balanced, but make no mistake, historic package to accelerate climate action. It is the UAE consensus.
The agreement calls for a transition away from fossil fuels to reach net zero emissions by 2050. And while the text has been more welcome than an earlier draft, activists and some delegations are already hailing the deal as weak and full of loopholes.
On the one hand, this is a good sign and signal that the world is finally dealing with fossil fuels after almost 3 decades of refusing to deal with it. But on the other hand, the new text includes cavernous loopholes that will allow for the oil and gas industry to continue.
Disagreements over fossil fuels had raised tempers at the summit and prevented the delegates from reaching an earlier consensus. And climate activists, like this 12-year-old girl who stormed the stage, are not letting leaders forget their responsibility.
You see, asking clean air to breathe, clean water to drink, and clean planet to live is all our basic rights, and asking those basic rights is completely unnecessary, you know? We must be having those basic rights right now, and we're not having that at all. So how is that fair?
2023 has been the hottest year on record, and scientists say there's only a few years left before climate change turns catastrophic. The signatories of Wednesday's deal will need to act in good faith to prevent that.
An agreement is only as good as its implementation. We are what we do, not what we say. We must take the steps necessary to turn this agreement into tangible actions.
The world must hope that these do not prove to be empty words. Patrick Chen and Harold Hughes for TaiwanPlus.
Up next, find out how baseball is bringing a new generation to an aging South Korean community.
In the face of adversity, the power of truth.
A roadmap for a just and open world. Charted by the freest country in Asia.
5, 4, 3,
to
A warm welcome to TaiwanPlus News. I'm Ian Kavat. Taiwanese semiconductor giant TSMC.
Public buses to be electric by 2030. A mission that begins with listening.
And telling the stories of Taiwan.
In Taipei for TaiwanPlus.
Drawing insight from original thinkers.
and sharing it with the world. TaiwanPlus News, a voice of freedom in Asia.
Welcome back. You're watching TaiwanPlus News. A Taiwanese writer has been arrested in China. Beijing's Taiwan Affairs Office says Liao Mengnian is being investigated for selling obscene material. Liao is known for his adult fantasy novels. He was based in China, and his family has not heard from him in over a year. China and Vietnam are building closer ties. The two sides announced 37 deals covering diplomatic relations and infrastructure. Those were revealed during a state visit to Hanoi by Chinese President Xi Jinping. His visit comes just 3 months after Vietnam upgraded ties with the U.S. and Japan. China and Vietnam have closely linked economies, but they also have a history of conflict, with competing claims in the South China Sea. For more on what Xi's Hanoi visit means, our reporter Louise Watt spoke to Him Tam Sang, a lecturer at the University of Social Sciences and Humanities in Vietnam.
There's a lot of historical animosity between China and Vietnam, and they have disputes over the South China Sea. Why do they want to elevate their ties now?
I think China is trying to seek Vietnam reassurance that the Southeast Asian country and its neighbors, really close neighbors, is not taking sides with any great powers, including the United States and its allies against China. And on its side, I think Vietnam is trying to appease China's concerns.
Vietnam earlier this year elevated its ties with the United States. Is it now closer to Washington or Beijing?
Vietnam is trying to balance amongst great powers, and we can denounce the strategy of hedging, trying to reap the benefits from both sides. So I think Vietnam is doing really, really well, because at this year we can see that at first we have a Joe Biden visit to Vietnam, and second we have a Chinese President Xi Jinping visit, and there has been many speculation that Vietnam might elevate ties with Australia next year to the same level as it has with the United States and China. So I think it's kind of a really successful policy of Vietnam, and it denotes Vietnam diplomatic statecraft amongst great power politics.
The US and China are both trying to increase their influence with Vietnam. Why is Vietnam important to them?
Vietnam can be considered as the focal point of Southeast Asia. If China wants to move southward, it has to encounter Vietnam in the South China Sea. And for China, if it has the intention of becoming a superpower, this is really kind of doubtful whether China has already sea power, because China has not dominated the South China Sea. And it's really important that China wants to keep Vietnam within its reach. And for the United States, if the United States can have Vietnam within its arms, and in doing so, it can have a kind of really comprehensive security alliance structure in the region to counterbalance against the influence of China.
That was Him Tam Sang from Vietnam's University of Social Sciences and Humanities, speaking with Louise Watt. Rohingya refugees in Indonesia are facing growing hostility. Protesters in the country's Aceh province say there are too many refugees from Myanmar taking up resources. Some Indonesians have taken to removing tents and threatening to push refugee boats back out to sea. The United Nations says more than 1,200 Rohingya have landed in Indonesia since November. The Myanmar military has been accused of genocide against the Rohingya, forcing them to flee the country. A record number of African migrants have fled to Spain's Canary Islands this year. Bryn Thomas takes a look at how one underage Senegalese migrant is finding community in the island's folk wrestling tradition.
With his legs planted firmly on the ground, this Senegalese wrestler is putting down roots in a new land. 13-year-old Sheikh Nada arrived in the Canary Islands in July. He came alone after a dangerous voyage from his birthplace in Senegal's capital, Dakar. And although he's new to Spain, he's no stranger to the ring.
Sama première fois fii laay commencé doog a bëre fii waaw ma jóge Sénégal waaw nekk jàmbaar waaw xam naa ne man su ma ñëwee fii damay bokk quoi su ma ñëwee si tubaab bi damay bokk ndax man dama doon bëre fee ay mbapat waaw loolaa moom.
Sheikh is among the record 32,000 African migrants to arrive in the islands this year. He's just one of an estimated 5,000 unaccompanied minors to make the dangerous trip.
Waaw ngelaw yi ñoo sonal gars yi quoi moo tax gars yi di dee waaw noonu la demee mais metti na trop quoi waaw yëfu góor la.
He was one of the lucky ones. A United Nations agency estimates that this year alone, over 500 people died making the 1,500-kilometer crossing from Senegal in West Africa to the Canary Islands. But with reports that at least 1,000 people are unaccounted for, the death toll is likely much higher. The migrants use the islands as a stepping stone to Europe, fleeing increasingly difficult economic and social conditions in their home country. Sheikh has been fortunate enough to find a community in the local wrestling tradition on the island of El Hierro.
Que ellos salen de su país, salen de su tierra, abandonan su familia para buscarse otra vida en otros horizontes, ¿no? Y claro, llegaron aquí al Hierro, pues están compenetrados con nosotros hemos hablado con ellos, pues les gusta la lucha porque muchos de ellos han hecho la lucha LAM, la senegalesa, y vamos, están integrados aquí con ellos y yo es que les tengo un cariño muy especial.
Senegal and the Canary Islands have their own folk wrestling traditions. In both forms, you win by making your opponent touch the ground with anything other than their feet. It's one thing familiar to Sheikh as he adjusts to unfamiliar surroundings. Many African migrants arriving in Europe end up working in agriculture, but Sheikh seems to have a future in the ring.
Dama yàgg dem ba Sénégal di daan moo tax mu bëgg ko quoi waaw sama xol la lekk quoi waaw.
Wrestlers anywhere will tell you that success in their sport requires a strong foundation and a stronger community. Far from his family and homeland, Sheikh Nada has found both. John Su and Bryn Thomas for TaiwanPlus.
Baseball is helping attract a new generation of young people to a small Korean island. John Van Trieste has this report.
A group of young people run with purpose across a sandy beach. They've come here to train, far from the distractions of home. If all goes to plan, the names stitched on their jerseys will one day be known across the country, and maybe even the world. This is Dokjeok Island, a tiny speck of South Korea in the Yellow Sea. Though just a few hours from the bright lights of Seoul, life here is far from fast-paced. Since the 1950s, the population's plummeted to just under 2,000 people. But things are changing, thanks to elite baseball manager Kim Hak-young. His plan is to turn the island, already used for spring training camps, into an incubator for Korea's next baseball champions. Promising student athletes from around the country enroll in the island's high school, where they're turned into pros. At the program's launch last year, 28 student athletes signed up. This year, 13 new teammates joined them. The school, once on the brink of closing, is now a lively place. For the An brothers, aged 16 and 17, it's been quite a journey from their hometown, 400 kilometers away. But it's one they say has been worthwhile.
아무것도 없어가지고 할 수 있는 게 진짜 운동장이랑 거기에 공도 있고 해가지고 할 수 있는 게 진짜 야구뿐이어가지고 그냥 심심하면 야구하고 뭐 그런 걸로 할 수 있어서 그런 목표에 갈 수 있을 것 같아요. 기회도 많이 준다 해서 형이랑 같이 왔는데 여기서 열심히 하면 주전으로 써주기도 하니까 그래서 더 열심히 하고 있는 것 같고 여기서 나중에 또 잘하면 프로 선수도 되고 네, 잘할 수 있으니까 좋은 것 같습니다, 여기.
Baseball is big business in Korea. The Pro League has 10 teams, and this year alone, their games have drawn more than 8 million fans. With good coaching and grueling training, the program promises to put Dokjok Island on the map as the birthplace of stars. It's taken a while for some locals to warm up to the idea, though. Much of the funding for the program comes from islanders' money, earned from sand dredged offshore that goes to construction sites in Seoul.
육지에서 있는 애들을 데려다가 우리 돈을 주냐. 그 나이 드신 분들이 그런 얘기를 하시죠. 그 이해를 못 하시고 우리 같은 사람들은 이제 그렇게 좀 전에 서두에 얘기했듯이 학교를 존립하고 독촉대 이런 발전 이런 거를 위해서 야구부 애들을 데려서 학교 폐교를 방지하고 존립하기 위해서 했지만은
But with time, many, like this 82-year-old, have been won over.
우리도 애들이 여기 와서 있는 거 좋아요. 그리고 점점 많이 들어오면 더 좋고. 근데 애들이 자꾸 준다 그러니까 그게 걱정이 되는 거죠.
The teams become the pride of this tiny island, and an example of how to revive South Korea's many small communities as the country's population ages. Devin Tsai and John Van Trieste for TaiwanPlus.
Thanks for tuning in to TaiwanPlus News. Visit our website for more of our stories or follow us on social media to get the latest updates. And before we go, soak in the holiday cheer as one of Taipei's biggest shopping areas lights up for Christmas. I'm Rik Glauert. Have a great evening.